Let me provide an alternative explanation too, given by William Gibson in his latest book and in one podcast interview that I listened to him probably last week, where he says that basically what he's noticed and what he wants all of us to be aware of is the fact that when futurists and science fiction writers get to a certain age, then they start looking at the world and comparing it to the world that they were seeing when they were young. And of course, they have to come to terms with their own mortality and the fact that everything was better when they were young. Not because that everything was better, but simply because they were young. And therefore, they end up committing the fallacy of claiming that the world is coming to an end, that the young generation is the worst young generation that ever came to be, that the dangers to us as a society are greater than they've ever been, and that we are soon going to reach the end of the world. And examples, range from, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to H.G. Wells to many other futurists and sci-fi authors. I went to watch recently Robert J. Sawyer talking on Humanity 2.0, and he said that he's a minority among science fiction writers because for the last 200 years, most sci-fi authors have that kind of an apocalyptic vision of the future. So don't you think that one way or another, I mean, your transhumanism, your diet, your sort of health regime, your desire to enhance your longevity, all of those are creating the perfect conditions in which, you would come up with a conclusion that, yes, our chances of surviving are almost zero.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, basically, it's like, how are you going to live? Like, am I going to, crawl on the couch and like moan for the next, rest of my life? Oh, woe is me. We're doomed as a species. Like, I think that's kind of futile because you're right. We don't know. I don't know. I think I have to go under the assumption that we're going to pull through this and we'll figure it out. We'll have a spectacular future and hopefully be part of that. And I really don't, I do get the doom and gloomness of science fiction. It certainly makes for more interesting stories. It might even make for more accurate stories in the sense of this hard science involved. Because ultimately, if you're to really, like you said, if you're to push me, George, what do you really think is going to happen? Well, I'm sorry to say, I don't think we're gonna survive it. But that doesn't mean my life is going to come to a stop. I still have to live day by day and hope that we, like I said, we hope that we do pull through. But one thing I do want to add to this conversation is, while I agree, it was William Gibson that I think you were quoting, while I agree that every generation is somewhat guilty of this and these kinds of recurring patterns, I do think, though, that as we're getting a sense as to where we're heading in the future, that it is an order of magnitude more dangerous than it ever has been. And now that we are now, we've never been, a species in possession of apocalyptic weapons, and we are now, and we're going to be increasingly in the possession of, much more threatening weapons that have these kinds of global scale in terms of their devastation, and that's unprecedented territory. And so I think it's maybe even a bit trivial and trite to suggest that we're just being worrisome again, and it's just same old generational problem. So I don't think we should understate the dangers that we're heading into.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly agree with that point, and I believe it's a very valid point, because I mean, it's one thing to be using an Iron Age sword; it's another thing to be using the latest in biological weapons of mass destruction, for example, which are the cheapest WMDs there are at the moment, at least. But let me move on our conversation here to the next step here, which is connected to that idea about finding SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I actually spent some time in NASA this summer, and I had the pleasure of attending a lecture given by Seth Shostak, who is not only very knowledgeable, but he's the funniest one of the funniest speakers I've ever seen live on
Wow.
stage. He has a killer
I've
sense of
never
humor.
never met him, never seen him
Yeah.
speak, so it's kind of neat to hear you say that.
He's so funny. I mean, his lecture is actually posted on my blog. I actually have the audio recording of it, and probably even his slides. His slides in the audio, not the video, but he's so funny. And in person, he's like, of course, 10 times funnier than just the audio. But I want to ask you about this idea about the Dysonian approach to SETI, and how is it different from what has been done up to now?
Right, and what you're referring to specifically is the paper that we recently had published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. We being my colleagues Milan Sturkovic and the late Robert Bradbury, who regrettably passed away while we were writing this paper. He had a massive stroke. Did you ever get a chance, by the way, to interview or even meet Robert Bradbury?
No.
That was a mind. I'll tell you, you would have loved, I think, to have him on a show like this. And anyways, in my opinion, he was the world's foremost expert in SETI studies. And with all due respect to Milan, I think he was an absolutely voracious collector of any paper and anything to do with whether it be SETI endeavors and the whole history of that action, but even through to what we're about to get into, which is the whole macro scale mega engineering aspect of things. So what we did, we put together a paper that largely had two components to it. One, it was a critique of modern SETI methods and their strategies, basically saying that, look, guys, this is starting to get a bit out of date now in terms of your approach. This was back to some old school thinking back in the 1960s with Frank Drake and that whole generation of thinkers. I mean, as mind expansive as it was and as innovative as it was in terms of this first group, thinking, my God, we could, set up our radio telescopes and listen for radio signals. It is unfortunately a project that has failed to date. And when I say that, I get a lot of people scoffing and said, well, of course it's failed today. We've only just started listening. And I think, unfortunately, a comment like that fails to recognize the degree to which, or rather, in this case, the improbability of actually getting a signal. We could be listening for the next million years. I guarantee you we're not going to get a radio signal. Or I understand it as well, SETI's looking for optical signals as well. As you're aware, Nicola, we as a radio transmitting civilization, that's coming to an end. That window was only about 100 years, 150 years or so. We are progressively cutting off our radio transmissions. So we're about to become quite invisible from a cosmological perspective. In other words, if we're going to hear another civilization, we're going to have to hear it within that tiny window, which is actually quite absurdly small. But second, the dissipative effects of radio signals over large distances is non-trivial, and by all accounts, even if a radio signal got to us here, it would be so dispersed in terms of its signal that we would not actually recognize it as such. So it's a futile effort all around. Not to mention, I mean, SETI claims that they're targeting specific areas that they feel would be prone to, or that life might be there. But for the most part, it's a rather blind haphazard approach to where they're listening for radio signals. So that was the first thing that we said. But not once to just leave it at that. We felt that SETI still can be very relevant, and they do need to change their model quite significantly in terms of how they should be conducting their activities, both in terms of how they're listening and even their approach to how they think of themselves and how we think of ourselves as a civilization in search of extraterrestrial intelligence. So what we said specifically is that SETI needs to adopt a more future-centric approach and take a look at the human trajectory, and this is where I came on board on the paper, where Robert Bradbury was the computational scientist and Milan was the cosmologist. I was the resident transhumanist on the paper that looked, at what happens to a civilization, to a species when it becomes quite advanced, and basically, the whole discussion of this post-biological existence, of being a digital civilization, invoking such things as what's referred to as the intelligence principle, which is the idea that as far as an intelligence can improve itself, it will continue to work to optimize itself to the greatest degree possible. So it's these kinds of realities, if you will, kind of getting a sense as to what the human trajectory is. We can extrapolate based on those trends and say, look, it's very possible, very likely, therefore, that extraterrestrial civilizations, particularly many of those that have come before us, will have gone through these same phases and will kind of result in this kind of a flourishing, this kind of advanced mode. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically, in other words, they shouldn't be looking for civilizations like ours, these kinds of immediate post-industrial civilizations. They need to be looking for post-singularity types, or even something we don't even know yet, but that we have to figure out what that might be, hence the kind of future-centric approach to SETI studies. So now from a practical perspective, okay, what can we actually do? What should we actually be looking for, therefore? And that's why we refer to it as Dysonian SETI, as we borrow the idea from the physicist Freeman Dyson, who was a big thinker in terms of these kinds of engineering projects that we may get ourselves involved in future. And the one that he came up with in this paper was only about like 1 page or so, was the so-called Dyson sphere, was this idea that we could create a shell around the sun at the distance of 1 AU, which would largely capture the entire energy output of the sun, which would basically make us into Kardashev. That's a Kardashev 2 civilization. A Kardashev 1 is when we're simply able to capture the entire energy output that's required to sustain the planet Earth. So I've seen many models as to, since that paper, how we could actually do this, how we could construct it, how the panels would look like. And what's interesting, though, about this, though, is you're not going to get 100% enclosure of the sun's output. In other words, there's going to be leakage, particularly in the infrared signal. And we know exactly, or at least have an idea in the band as to what that signal would be, and that's what we should be looking for. So when we do look up into the heavens and we aim our telescopes up there, we should be looking for that very specific signature. It wouldn't tell us, absolutely that's a Dyson sphere, but it might make us, rub our chins a little bit and go, geez, what is that? Could that actually be an alien civilization? And that's one example of many. I mean, we do refer to it as Dysonian simply to give it the sense of that mega scale aspect. We need to be looking out for the kinds of engineering activities that an advanced extraterrestrial might be engaged in, whether it be stellar uplifting, stellar engines, and even waste products, the kind of factoryization, if you will, of their activities. And figure out what those signatures might look like, and basically the challenge here, not only in discovery and identification, but to distinguish it from natural phenomenon. I mean, as you're aware, when we discovered pulsars a few decades ago, the first thought was, oh my God, that's got to be alien. That there's no way that something like that could exist in nature. But we've since learned that actually, yes. Pulsars are in fact a natural phenomenon. So that's going to be one of our challenges, is to basically stop and ask ourselves, okay, what could, what's synthetic or artificial and what's natural? And it would be nice as well. This is also what we said in the paper, is that we also should be looking for actual signals that are meant to get our attention, what are called calling cards, if you will. So one example, I think. By a French cosmologist, he had this idea where an ETI could put these have objects rotate around the sun that are very obviously artificial, so like a huge square, a circle, maybe a smiley face, I don't know. But it's kind of thing that you look at and go, yeah, that can't possibly be natural, and that's a very, I kind of maybe exaggerate, but I did that by design, because there's no way that could be, they would figure out a way to make it very obvious that they're trying to get our attention, much the same way that Carl Sagan had assumed that they would through radio signals. And in his very famous book now, Contact, it was through the transmission of prime numbers, that there's nothing in nature that we know of that can produce this regularity of prime numbers, because it's such a bizarre set of numbers. So that's what that was the paper. And I did send, by the way, the paper to Seth Shostak, and I never heard back from him. So I just thought I'd pass that on. Who knows if they'll adopt this particular strategy in the future.